And then I'll talk about the relationship between the two works, so that it's clear what the Discourses does in addition to what we have in the Prince, so that people can understand the relationship. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the political context, the geopolitics at the time, especially the politics of the Italian city-states, of which he was deeply involved in Florence, the Florentine city-state. I think it's necessary to explain that, because that essentially provided the topography and the territory for these two works. So that's why I will do that very briefly. Then I'm going to talk to you, ladies and gentlemen, about very substantive matters, partly about his personal life. We don't know all that much about him. There's a period in his life that we know very little about. Perhaps it's a good thing that we don't know too much about him, because he wasn't a particularly devout man. He was substantively subversive in many respects, and I'm using the word subversive deliberately, and I'll explain a bit later. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Then I'll talk to you about the main themes in his political and philosophical writings: the anatomy of power, the primacy of leadership, the formative influence of war and war-making. I'll talk to you about the relationship between love and fear in politics, very, very important theme in Machiavelli. And I'll talk to you about the politics of loyalty and the politics of generosity. You'll see why I've chosen those themes. There are a few other themes, but these are the ones that I think one can develop and flesh out very nicely, and one can find quite interesting resonance with what we see currently in this country and beyond. And I'll also talk to you about a very, very important theme, and that's the theme of truth. Truth and post-truth. Fake news. The language of the Economist newspaper talking about we live in an age of post-truth politics. How did Machiavelli deal with that construct of truth and untruth? And what do we see today happening in the world, not only with Donald Trump, but with many other politicians as well, trying to manipulate the borders of truth and trying to dress untruths up as if actually they are truthful. Machiavelli had particularly interesting insights into this. And then I'll draw a broad philosophical conclusion on why I believe Machiavelli matters. Perhaps some of you would say one should start with that, but I thought otherwise. I'd like to conclude with that. Why actually does he matter? So let's give it a great go. Ladies and gentlemen, Niccolò Machiavelli, as I think most of you know, particularly the students and the others need to know that, was born in the 15th century. In fact, he was born in 1469 and he died in 1527. He was born in the great Renaissance city of Florence, which was really the epicenter of the Renaissance and of humanism, not only in Italy, but in Europe as a whole. Now, he was just one of many distinguished people who happened to have been born in Florence. Michelangelo was another. Ghiberti, the great sculptor, was yet another. Rossini, the composer, was also born in Florence. And Florence has this very distinguished history of producing these remarkable, innovative, creative, artistic souls, of which Machiavelli most certainly was one. Now, I said Machiavelli was not a devout man. He was not devout in terms of religious belief. He critiqued particularly the corruptive force of religion. long before Karl Marx spoke about the opium of religion. Machiavelli spoke about the corruptive force of religion, if religion is abused for particular purposes. So again, you will see a very interesting resonance with philosophers that came much later. Now, he was not anti-moral, but he was amoral. He argued contrary to the humanist tradition of the time that one should not look at politics in an ethical, moral frame, but one should frame politics in terms of power, in terms of influence, in terms of fear, in terms of love, in terms of generosity, and in terms of the anatomy of political power. So that sets him apart from other philosophers at the time. And most notably, of course, very starkly with Plato and the tradition of Aristotle and Plato and Cicero and Socrates and others who privileged the ethical life as the cornerstone of politics. Machiavelli said no, and you'll see tonight why he argued differently. You can't start there. You may end up with certain moral prescriptions, but you should not start your analysis of history and politics from the ethical frame. You should start it from the frame of power, from the frame of skill, from the frame of virtue, and so on. And I'll talk about that a lot tonight to build that out. So some people then later call that whole approach Machiavellianism. In other words, playing power and playing the game of power in a very brutal way, and also in a rather corrupt way. So that I think I want to mention right at the outset. And that already suggests one reason why he's interesting to look at, because he had a different construct of politics and of history more generally. Now, Machiavelli, ladies and gentlemen, if you read his biographers, and there's still a whole stream of those today, surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, one biographer, a very good one incidentally, described him as a man who suffered from the running disease. He was never at ease. He didn't want to be quiet. He reminds me of my dear colleague Job Amupanda, you know. He's running all over the place, in a good way also. But a man that just couldn't be quiet. We have some politicians in our country who also are like that, you know. They don't acquiesce that easily. They run around, they try to find things for themselves. Now, I said at the outset that he wrote 13 major works, of which today mostly we only look preeminently at the very thin, slim volume, The Prince. But he also, of course, wrote the Discourses, which contains the same themes that one finds in The Prince, but ends up with an elaboration of why a republican form of government is preferred. So it takes the political narrative much further than The Prince, but it's the same set of themes. But he also wrote decennials. Decennials were 10-year histories of Florence and the Florentine Republic. He wrote 2 of those decennials. He wrote, of course, as I said, The Prince. The Prince was published a little later, but The Prince was written between 1513 and 1515, when he was actually out of active politics. And it's an interesting question. Why did he write these 2 major works after he left active politics? Not while he was at it, while he was at the coalface, especially as a diplomat, and I'll explain that as well. And then, of course, the Discourses, which took a bit longer, but the Discourses also were written at the same time as The Prince. So there's quite a strong resonance between the 2 works. But then he also wrote plays and fables. One fable in English is called The Devil Who Took a Wife. What a lovely title, The Devil Who Took a Wife. You can imagine the devilish things that happen. And many of these plays and fables were set in courts and in houses of great eminence and importance. And he was very good with irony, and he loved really to take people out of his ordinary life and his own life experience and to turn them into characters in his plays and in his fables. He wrote a wonderful comedy called Andrea. I was quite worried because it's quite close to Andre. I thought maybe the comedy could have been titled Andre, but it is mercifully entitled Andrea. And then he wrote 2 discourses on the history of the Florentine Republic and public affairs. And he wrote another smaller book, which today, unfortunately, really didn't survive whole. But it was a book with a title, I think many of you will know, the very famous book, The Art of War. But he wrote one too. I'm not talking about the Chinese scholar now, I'm talking about Machiavelli, The Art of War. So he was really a very multi-dimensional person. His family, ladies and gentlemen, owned considerable properties in Florence, and his family has always been active in the politics and the lawmaking of Florence as a city-state. In fact, from his family came no less than 4 magistrates who ended up being magistrates in Florence. But 2 of his relatives, one was actually convicted for theft and the other one was put to death because he opposed the regime of the few in the Florentine Republic. So this rebellious streak, this naughtiness, it was very much part and parcel of the family out of which Machiavelli came. I think most of you know that he made his mark in politics when he became a diplomat. Although he never joined the Lawyers' Guild like his father and like other members of the family. And it was quite unexpected that he was appointed as a second emissary in the Chancery in Florence as a diplomat. And his diplomacy extended way beyond Florence and Florentine matters, but also into Spain and into other parts of Italy. And he worked very closely with very famous Florentine diplomats that I'll talk to you about in a moment, in bringing the Papal States together. So much of the experience that we read about in the Prince and the Discourses were actually his own personal experiences that he reworked and reflected upon to produce these marvelous works of great prose, some of the best prose in the Italian language. If one reads Italian, my Italian is very rusted, unfortunately, but I battled with dictionaries to try and understand some of the Italian, and it's absolutely wonderful. It's rich and marvelous. But I told you that I need to tell you a little bit about the politics and the geopolitics of the Italian city-states. Because without that, I don't think we'll have a context to understand the themes and to dissect the Prince and the Discourses. Now, there were many Italian city-states as early as the 12th century, right through the 13th, 14th, 15th century. There were many of them, but there were 5 that were very important, 5 that really shaped the politics of that whole peninsula called Italy. And I want to emphasize that Italy never had, for many centuries, had a central government. And perhaps some people would even say today, Italy has no political center still, because it's always, regions, it's factions, it's the north, and the south is a competitive set of interests. And even today, that's the hallmark of Italian politics. Now, the most famous one, of course, that I will talk to you about tonight is the city-state of the Florentine of Florence, the city-state, the Florentine city-state. I'll talk to you about that at length because that's the one where Machiavelli grew up in, and that's the one where he became active in the political life of that city-state. But the hallmark of all the city-states, with few exceptions, perhaps the papal states were the exception, but the hallmark of all the other city-states as well was that they were built on very strong guilds. They were built on very strong, powerful families who had a great deal of wealth and a great deal of personal power, and who were able to control the politics, the economy, the trade, the international relations of those city-states. Florence was particularly interesting. It was not only the Medici family, but there were many others, as I'll tell you shortly, in Florence, who also in different periods of the history of the Florentine city-state played a major role. So that is interesting. Now, the five major city-states apart from Florence was the papal states that had Rome as their capital. But the papal states had very interesting formation in terms of their geography. They actually ran up the Apennine Mountains, sort of the spine of Italy, right up to the north and to the south. And the papal states I'm not going to talk to you about tonight, but it's important that the papal states matters a great deal, and there were lots of conflicts and competition between the papal states and the other Italian city-states. So one needs to know a little bit about that history. Then, of course, there was Florence. Florence was the wealthiest at that time of all the Italian city-states, but it was not only the wealthiest, it was also the wealthiest in the whole of Western Europe at the time, Florence. It was hegemonic, enormous wealth built on finance and banking, and Roman will know is the history of banking and finance. If one studies that, we have to study Florence. It's absolutely essential. It was extraordinarily powerful, but the fortunes of Florence, like that of other city-states, also fluctuated. It's not only Namibia that encounters headwinds. I always have to laugh when the president says, you know, we are now encountering a headwind. When you look at the city-states and you look at the 14th century at Florence, you'll also see they encountered major headwinds because the financial sector, the banking sector, but also the production of wool and cotton and so on, and clothes went into a very serious decline, not least of all because of the ongoing wars and conflicts. Florence had a 30-year-long war with Milan. Milan was the other city-state of great consequence, which was controlled by the Vicente family, Milan. They were a very brutal bunch. There were three brothers who inherited, and the two of them conspired to murder the one, and so on. So when you read about, murder, and you read about, cruelty, and you read about the logic of cruelty in Machiavelli's work, you can know the context actually was the Italian city-states. That's where it actually emanated from. And then there was, of course, Venice. Venice was, those of you who know Italy, was at the head of the Adriatic Sea, was the preeminent maritime power for much of the time in which, of course, Machiavelli lived and worked. But Venice was interesting. Unlike the others, it was ruled by an hereditary elite. It was an hereditary elite that ruled Venice as a city-state. Again, you see the interesting parallels with early African politics. It wasn't that different at all. One of the major problems I find, for example, when I read our president with great respect, he always refers to the Greek city-states as the beginning and then later the evolution of representative democracy. And that's the classical way of doing it, looking at the Polis and Aristotle and so on. He never refers to the Italian city-states. And I suspect he doesn't, because the history of the Italian city-states was rather different to the Greek experience of the Polis. And the Italian city-states was never the politics of the center. And it was never the politics of nation building and of union. It was a different historical narrative. And I find it very interesting that the politicians somehow don't look at the Italian city-states to understand the other side of the coin in politics and in nation building, and the other forces that can break you apart. It's very important, I believe, that one has those insights. As I said, Florence was driven by finance, by commerce, by long-distance trade, and of course by manufacturing, particularly cloth manufacturing. And that went into very serious decline. And then, of course, Florence was also wiped out in 1348 by plague. 40% of the inhabitants of Florence died in 1 year, 40%, because of the plague, the Great Plague that hit Europe in the 14th century. The Black Death, as it was called in other parts of Europe, also hit Italy. I'm mentioning that, and with this tradition of the guilds and the trade, and then the idea, Florence, just for interest's sake, was an oligarchy. It was not a democracy, it was an oligarchy controlled by 9 signoria in Italian, 9 signatories, which all had the backing of the powerful guilds and the powerful families. So it was like a Politburo almost, of politics. And sorry for that slip, but I've deliberately chosen that word, because that's exactly how it worked, It wasn't that democratic at all. And there were several dominant families in Florence. Most of us would know the Medicis. I think virtually everyone would identify Florence with the Medicis, but there were others. There were the Albizis and there were the Pizzi family, very, very powerful families that were later on replaced by the Medicis in a very important context when Florence was in decline. And the Medicis were able, with external support, to come to power and then, to dominate the Florentine state. Machiavelli, and I will not talk much longer about his personal life because much of it is fascinating, but some of it is quite disturbing. But it's important that we know a little bit about him. He's mostly known for the fact that not only that he was an author, a military person, a historian, a writer on political power and theory, in a sense a philosopher, but he was also a very skilled diplomat. And he worked in one of these great palazzos in Florence, up on the upper floor, worked with a very famous diplomat, Cesare Borgia. Borgia was very, very famous, the most famous Italian diplomat ever, one could argue. Borgia was the man who mediated amongst the city-states and who also made sure that the papal states were reassembled and put together again. And Machiavelli learned from him by doing it and by accompanying him to several other countries, including to France and to Spain, to learn the craft and the art of diplomacy. Okay, let me leave it there. I'll come back to some of this when we go into the substantive aspects of Machiavelli. Now, what are the great themes in these works? What are the great themes? And then I'll try and unpack a few of them. I'll try to draw out some inferences and reflect quite critically on our current state of affairs in our own country. And then I end off with a little bit of philosophical wrap-up of why Machiavelli matters so much and why we need to read him and continue reading him and interpreting him and valuing him for what he did and left behind. What were the great themes in these two works? Well, one of them obviously is God and religion, which I'm not going to discuss tonight. I've decided not to talk about that, but it is an important theme, as you all know, the conflict between the papal states and the other Italian city-states and so forth. Then it also talks about divine friendship. Not friendship, dear friends, but divine friendship. Friendship that can endure the challenges and that can sustain itself in unique ways. How does one build friendship in politics? Then he talks about heroism a lot and why war is ineluctably a part of heroism. Why one builds heroic status and iconic status through war. You can already see some of the interesting parallels emerging in our own country, where the narrative is inevitably linked to the liberation struggle, to war, to conflict. Machiavelli did a lot of interesting work around this. I'll talk a little bit more substantively about that. And then he spoke about the way of evil, not the way of goodness or being good, but being evil and unkind. Because the assumption that he made as a realist, as a political realist, was that, to quote him directly, we are enveloped in the laces of evil. We can't escape evil. We are enveloped in it. It's a very strong quotation, but it's a very important one. And then he said, we cannot discount evil and meanness in politics. We have to come to terms with evil because it's ineluctably part of life and of the political and the body politic. So it was, for some analysts, Machiavelli was sort of half beast, half man. Half beast, half man. This extraordinary paradox that he lived in Florence, which was the epicenter of the Renaissance. He was a humanist. He had all the humanist values of scholarship, of writing, of art, of plays and theater and music. He had all of that. But he was not a humanitarian. What an interesting debate. Can you be a humanist and not a humanitarian? Because the two are not the same. You can be a humanist, but you don't necessarily have to be a humanitarian. And I'll come back to that right at the end. One of the very fascinating issues in Machiavelli's work. He wrote about ambition. He wrote about immodesty and ingratitude. Ambition, immodesty, and ingratitude. To quote him from the Discourses, and it resonates powerfully with later philosophers like Thomas Hobbes particularly, Machiavelli writes in the Discourses, men leap from one ambition to another. They leap from one ambition to another. Hobbes wrote, power after power. Men want power after power. Machiavelli wrote about men leap from one ambition to another. On love, he famously wrote that, and I'll come to that now in a minute. He says, why bother yourself with love? Ideally, in an ideal world, it's wonderful to balance love and fear. But in politics, if you have to choose, you have to choose fear and not love. Because as he wrote, wonderful, wonderful, strong language, the lover dies in a ditch. The lover dies in a ditch and in despair. What does this mean? This means that if you are seeking love or you seek to be loved in politics, you make yourself extraordinarily vulnerable. You'll be exploited. People will exploit you endlessly because labor in a sense, get close to you. And the more you emphasize love, the more vulnerable you become, the more fragile you become. Now, what was important for Machiavelli was that the kind of politics that he eventually developed in these two works, and I will use that as an introduction and then talk to you about 6 of the main themes. The kind of politics that he actually proposed and developed was the politics that could transcend the immediacy. In other words, the immanental things, the things that we need to do immediately. But the politics that can transcend that can take a longer look, a more strategic look at the future. He wrote about that. And to do that, we need to combine the humanist ideals of fame and virtue. You have to be virtuous. You also have to have the idea of fame and the heroic notions of politics. You have to combine virtue with virtuosity. Interesting argument. Combine virtue with virtuosity. You have to combine it with valor. You have to combine it with character and ability. Because if you read the discourses, and particularly the Prince especially, you'll see if you want to be successful politically, fame is not enough. Virtue is not enough. You need character, but above all, you need ability. You must be able to capture power and to hold it, and to exercise it, and to use it to your own interest and your own advantage. So in other words, you must be able to decide. You must be a decision maker and not a procrastinator. Machiavelli wrote beautifully about it, the failure of decision making in politics. I'll come to that now. Because he said time runs out for you. Time runs out. It's not indefinite. It's not infinite. It runs out. So while you have power, while you have legitimacy, while you have support, while people fear you, that's when you decide to act. Don't wait, because time, the fleet of time is going to leave you behind. You're going to be too late. You see? Interesting stuff. This idea of ability, of virtue, of fame, of valor, of character. Very, very critical. I'll come to that right at the end through a different avenue. So let me now, dear friends, very quickly highlight maybe 6 of the main themes in his writings. There are many others, as I already indicated, but I'd like to talk to you about 6. Now, it's interesting that Machiavelli, in contrast to Plato, was not interested, as I already said, in transparency, in accountability, in ethical leadership. He wasn't interested in that. He was interested in ability, capacity, virtuosity, heroism, the capacity to act, to make decisions if you have to, and to make them brutally if you have to. He famously said that the worst thing you can do is to wound your enemies lightly. Because if you wound them lightly, they're bound to come back at you. So you destroy them. Don't injure them lightly, because they'll come back. They'll eat you, and they'll pursue you and track you down. So don't do that. If you deal with your enemies, deal with them brutally. Strategically, take them out, silence them. Don't allow them space, and don't wound them lightly, because they'll come back. They'll look for revenge. Don't give them that opportunity. It's a very brutal stuff, but it's very real in the real world of politics. It's very, very real. Okay, now comes something very interesting. So unlike Plato, he was not interested in accountability, ethical leadership, in the higher order of things, in the great thematics of politics. He was interested in the art of politics as the practical. What can you do? How you gather power, how you consolidate power, how you exercise power, how you keep power once you have it. So that was a very important contrast. Okay, now comes the hot stuff, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen. I think the temperature ought to rise now, and I will certainly make sure that it rises. So, what is the first theme in Machiavelli that I'd like to talk to you about? There are 6, as I indicated, very briefly. The first one is Machiavelli asked the question in The Prince, what are the best ways to hold power and to hold the state together? In other words, the anatomy of power. How do you capture it and how do you hold it? What did he say? He had said many things. The first thing he said was you must install your own people in positions of authority. People that you can trust, that you can work with, that are loyal to you. In other words, you have to build a kind of patron-client model of politics, but not in the way that those people can actually hurt you or make you vulnerable. But you make them partly dependent on you, but you are also partly dependent on them in a kind of reciprocity that you need to develop. He also said that you use symbols, symbolic uses of politics, to quiet certain regions, outlying regions, to make them feel that they belong. Use symbolic politics. Use symbolic politics, but in a way that they can't build up reputation and alternative leadership to yourself. So don't allow them too much scope or too much room, because then they may develop their alternative leadership and they may gain alternative reputations that will rival your own. Don't do that. So make sure where the center of power lies. The ANC debate, as many of you know, for a number of years was the so-called 2 centers of power. Some people are now talking about that in Namibia, more than 1 center of power. Machiavelli would say there should only be 1 clear center of power, which in a sense cannot be challenged. And the others can be there, but in a way that they can't increase their power to pose counter-hegemonic power to the center or to the prince. Very important. I already mentioned that. He said, don't only deal with present problems, but particularly deal with future problems. So be strategic, plan, think ahead, conceptualize the problems that lie ahead of you, rather than just the immediate issues. Do not waste time when you have power, because time will run out. Do something with it. Don't be a lame president. Don't be a president for more than 2 decades and achieve very little. Do something with your power while you have it. And you can see the inference that I draw to one of our former presidents that ostensibly did rather little in 10 years. He finds it even difficult to remind us what he did in 10 years. Be aware of the flight of time. Harold Wilson, the former British Prime Minister, famously, I think Roman will remember, once said, a week is a long time in politics. A week is a long time in politics. Once you're there, once you have power, people expect you to do things, to act, to make decisions, to be decisive. So don't waste it. Use that to consolidate yourself and to act while you still have it. In other words, consolidate your power very quickly and make decisions in ways that are visible and ways that will have a lasting impact, not only now, but also into the future. So this was just some ideas around the first theme, the best ways to hold a state, to hold power and to sustain power. Second major theme, and this brings us much closer to home, was the theme of reform and change. Our president prides himself that he's a reformer. And he has a history of being one. Let's be honest, let's be fair. Let's not be unjust and unfair to him. But Machiavelli wrote some very interesting things about reform and change. The constant in politics, change. The only constant we have in life, change. Machiavelli's most famous statement on this, which I think many of you know by heart, I hope, was that he said, reforming an existing order of things is one of the most difficult and dangerous things the prince can do. This very famous statement, reforming an existing order of things, is one of the most dangerous, one of the most difficult things a politician can undertake. Because people generally are reluctant to change. Some people that benefited are unlikely to make major changes. And change raises great expectations. Some people want everything to happen very quickly, very rapidly and decisively. So change is a very difficult moment in the political terrain for leaders. And I think we know that also in this country. Very difficult to manage and politically to deal with. Now, Machiavelli then did something quite extraordinary. And I want to talk about that tonight. He said, one of the greatest mistakes, there are many, but one of the greatest mistakes a leader can make in a context of change and reform is to try to satisfy everybody's expectations. You can't. He understood that fully. You can't satisfy all the expectations of everybody in the state or of all your citizens or those that are holding power with you. You can only satisfy an X number of expectations at a particular point in time. So don't overpromise and underdeliver. As Niccolò always says, that is a recipe for disaster in politics. He then always adds, rather underpromise and overdeliver. And this comes from Machiavelli. Machiavelli was very clear on this in the context of reform and change. Because he said that inevitably the leader will disappoint some of his or her followers. But the leader then needs the capacity and the resources so that those who are disappointed can keep on supporting him. Listen to this carefully, dear friends. Since you cannot meet all the expectations and meet all the conflicting desires or appetites, to quote Aristotle or Hobbes, the same idea, exactly the same, because of the context of scarcity, you can't do it. But what you need in addition, you need the ability and the resources and the understanding to keep those people whose expectations you did not meet, to keep them happy and to ensure that you have their support. It's where we are currently in this country, exactly where we are. That entrepreneurs can't get enough, but they can't get what they got until now because the economy and the social system can no longer provide. We can't do it anymore. So people get angry, people get disillusioned. And people are talking all sorts of interesting things in our body politic because of that. So reform and change, the most interesting theme, most central theme in his writings. Third theme, the most delightful, perhaps the most controversial, criminal virtue. Listen to the language, not virtue, but criminal virtue. What is criminal virtue for Machiavelli? Machiavelli says criminal virtue is virtue that one can actually secure and that you can have, and how you can secure your power through cruel, immoral deeds, including the execution of your political rivals and the spreading of some measure of untruth. Criminal virtues. Let me quote him. He said, "A leader should carefully calculate all the wicked deeds he needs to do to secure his power. Calculate carefully all the wicked deeds the leader should do to secure his power. And then, once that calculation has taken place, execute them in one stroke. Execute them quickly, brutally, rapidly, so that you don't have to commit other forms of wickedness and criminal virtues while you have power. Swift, surgical action. Calculate the wicked things that you ought to do to secure and maintain power, execute them brutally, abruptly, and then move on. Because he says if you do that, your subjects will forget the cruel deeds, and your reputation as a leader will not suffer. But if you don't do that, you will remain vulnerable. If you have to act brutally, then do so. Joseph Disho recently spoke about fear in our incumbent. He wrote this article, going up a fearpreneur, a new word that he coined. I don't know there is such a word in the English language, Roman. I doubt it. But a fearpreneur, a person who deals in fear. I'm not saying it's true, but it's pretty Machiavellian to see the president like that. Very, very Machiavellian. Maybe Disho is Machiavellian himself, I don't know. Maybe he's angry because of what he had and lost, quite foolishly, you see. So it's interesting stuff, very interesting stuff. Now, so do not wound your adversaries lightly, because if you do, they will seek revenge. So do things brutally and calculate the criminal virtues that you need to execute, and then go about and do so. And I think we've had some examples, in a sense, not of murder and brutality in that sense, but we've had some examples in our recent politics. In fact, this happened to the very incumbent in power. He also lost his position of authority by the former president, one of them, and then came back. And somehow the reputation hasn't been damaged too much of both those individuals. I'm not suggesting we should do that, but I'm just referring to that as an example. Then he deals with war quite extensively, which I'll go through very quickly, but it's a very critical part of the Prince particularly, but also, of course, of the discourses. War is the theatre where leaders prepare for the hardships and the challenges of political life. War is the best theatre to prepare. And again, you can see the historical references in Namibia, where many of our leaders came through a context of war, extended war, where they prepared themselves not only for war, but also for politics and for taking over power after independence. So leaders should not read books, I must tell you, somewhat disappointingly, when they should prepare for war. And they should use peace to prepare themselves for war, because war ultimately is the theatre of politics. And therefore Machiavelli also said that leaders must hunt frequently. You must hunt frequently. So you must kill, you must understand the logic of war and the logic of killing, so that you can keep your body fit and you can learn the landscape that surrounds your territory if you hunt. It's an old, very deeply entrenched notion, this idea of hunting. Very, very fundamental to humanity. It goes to the very core of humanity and the very core of survivalist ethics. Become a hunter, because then you learn to fend for yourself. Then you will be able to survive. And then you'll be able to make war, conduct war in ways where you can win them rather than lose them. And this is the interesting parallel. Machiavelli and the famous writings on war of Sun Tzu, the Chinese philosopher. And I looked at Sun Tzu again last night, a wonderful work, The Art of War. And Machiavelli is very similar. Of course, much later than Sun Tzu, but he was very similar. The idea of making your strategic assessments, making sure you've got the resources. If you have to fortify, you can fortify long enough so you can survive, you don't perish. The element of surprise in war, the force of momentum. Many of you will know wonderful metaphor of Sun Tzu. War is like rolling logs and rocks. What a wonderful metaphor. If you want to be successful in war, you have to be able to metaphorically roll the logs and the rocks so that you can overpower your enemies and your opponents. And use peace to prepare for war. Use peace to prepare for war. There's more on war, but I won't say too many more things around war, except to emphasize the strategic nature of planning, of having resources, of becoming self-sufficient during war and surviving war, so that you can meet any enemy on the battlefield. But very critically during war, the most demanding requirement, apart from the strategic ones, is to keep the morale of your soldiers high. Keep the morale of your soldiers high. Some of you may not know, but Machiavelli unsuccessfully mounted an army to free Pisa from Florence, when Florence was overpowered by the Florentine Republic. And of course he failed. That was the direct reason why he was pushed out of public life. But he actually mounted a small little army, hoping that they would be able to defend and to free Pisa. So he spoke a very personal experience. Almost there, war was number 4, I think, if I recall correctly. I'm not so sure now, but let's say it was number 4. Another theme which I do need to talk to you about a great deal is the theme of justice and generosity. I already told you earlier on that if a leader is overtly generous to his subjects, he will not be appreciated. And he will only cause greed for more generosity. It's an extraordinary insight. It's pretty brutal, but it's very true. If you're over-generous in politics, you will be vulnerable, and you will actually provide the motor for greater forms of greed and reliance. You'll open yourself up to, in modern language, to be captured, state capture, entrepreneurship, and so on. Peter Nutt, who sits here in front, coined the word, become a corruptocracy. A corruptocracy. And Machiavelli understood that, know the limits of generosity in politics. Being overtly generous, he said, after all, is not only vulnerable and will not only lead to more greed, but it's not economical. It's not sustainable. Because you're going to exhaust your resources. You're going to provide more and more, and people will continue asking for more and more. And the result of that will be higher taxes, debt, and grief to the leader. Grief to the leader. And then if the leader decides, because of economic difficulties or other issues, to limit his generosity, he becomes a miser, and he's been looked upon as a fool in politics. People will say, oh, I told you so. You can't sustain this. This is not sustainable, so don't go down that road. You can see the echoes it has in our political life and in the life of many, many other countries. So yes, state largesse is important, but don't be over-generous with it, because that opens yourself up to great vulnerability, and also opens yourself up that people whom you are generous to, obviously you will become more greedy, and you'll exhaust your resources, and you'll go into difficulties. Okay. Cruelty and mercy, briefly, I must say something on it very briefly, not for long, because time is running. I need to stop very shortly. And then I do want to talk to you about truth, because I think this is perhaps one of the most interesting dimensions of Machiavelli. Cruelty and mercy. If you have to choose between being loved or being feared in politics, Machiavelli writes, ideally you would like to be both. You'd like to be loved and you'd like to be feared. But he said if it's difficult to combine these two, which is often the case in politics, he said it's far safer to be feared than to be loved. Can't combine the two, then let people fear you. In politics, it's preferable. So it's this whole interface between generosity, love, fear, generosity, parsimony, and the reputation for being generous. And here I want to quote one of the most wonderful passages in the discourses. Machiavelli says the following. He says you need to have a reputation for generosity. But if your actions as a leader are influenced by that desire to be seen as being generous, that desire as part of your reputation, you will come to grief. You will come to grief. It's nice to be seen to be generous, but if that feeling, that desire to be generous becomes part of the way you are and how you build your reputation and the foundation of your reputation and standing in politics, you will come to grief. Because you will practice generosity at your own expense, at your own cost. And Machiavelli prophetically almost warns against the ostentatious life of the leader. Don't lead the lavish life the high life. Don't lead the high life and the lavish life, the ostentatious life. Because ultimately you come to grief. A wonderful insight. The leader must shun the flatterers. Shun the people who flatter you. Listen to the people who criticize you. That's an incredibly important insight into life and into academic life and into politics. Machiavelli writes unashamedly, shun the flatterers, those who swarm in the courts and engage you. Why must you shun them? Because they deal in untruth and in self-deception. It's powerful stuff. It's wonderful stuff, but it's great stuff. So shun the flatterers. And then he deals with the issue, which is the last topic I want to talk about, and I'll do a very brief wrap-up. Then he deals with this question of truth and who should have freedom to speak to the prince. Whom should you listen to? And Machiavelli extraordinarily says there are three kinds of advisors in politics. There are advisors who understand things in themselves, who understand things, almost intercede, who have an insight into how things work, what the realities are. To those you must listen. But you only listen to them on questions that you ask their advice on nothing else. Secondly, he said there are advisors, he calls them spies, incidentally, Roman, lovelier, spies. He says then a second group of advisors are those who have a fairly strong understanding of things in themselves, but who have the ability to explain things to citizens. Those you need. Because those advisors can make complex things simple, can explain them, can go out, can be a spokesperson for you, can explain policies or budgets or whatever it might be. Those you need, Machiavelli said. And then he said you get a third category of advisors or spies who are only interested in self-aggrandizement and self-deception, who know nothing, who understand little, and who cannot explain anything. And those you avoid. Okay, now, the last aspect that I want to talk about, and then I'll say something about Namibia, and then I'll draw a conclusion. It's the question of truth. I said earlier that Machiavelli was one of the first writers, philosophers who understood this complex thing called truth in politics. And he started out by saying that if you want to create the illusion of truth, not truth necessarily, but the illusion of truth, you have to be seen as a person that keeps his or her word. In other words, you have to be seen as a consistent person that keeps his or her word. Okay? But when the truth does not serve your strategic purposes, you should actually deal in untruths. It's an extraordinary insight, because often this is how politics actually works, you know, where the truth doesn't fit your strategic purposes, whatever those are, then you start dealing in the untruths. Then you start to move away from truth as a dictum. But you keep the illusion that you are speaking the truth. And this is, you know, I'll give you some examples right now. I'm not going to draw examples from Namibia, because I think that might be too close to the bone. But there are such examples where people are pretending that they speak the truth, but strategically, because it's in their interest not to deal with the truth, they continue pretending that they actually dealt in the truth all along. And they have said nothing but the truth. Now, let me give you two contemporary examples. They're not Namibian, but you can think about Namibian examples. There are some. One is the famous example, or the infamous example, of the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, with the Iraqi war, where, and I quote directly, if you read the transcripts of that inquiry, you will read the following. I quote directly: the British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently bought significant quantities of uranium from Africa. Listen to the language. The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently bought significant quantities of uranium from Africa. The statement did not read, it was reported that Saddam Hussein, but the British government learned that, implying it's truth, it's the truth. We learned it. We established it, as it were, independently. We verified it. That's what it means. And then, of course, that statement was transmitted, amongst others, to the Bush presidency. And those of you interested, you should read those debates. They're fascinating. Where Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State, and Ronald Rumsfeld, the security guy, well, at the end of the day, they had to pay the price for the big lie, not the president. One example. And this was a very interesting example because in the 2000 elections in the United States, when you look at the Gallup polls and you look at, the opinion polls, 80% of the voters said they voted for Bush because of his honesty. They voted for him because he's an honest man. We like it. Clean, open face, honest guy. We voted for him. That's one example. Another example, as you might well surmise, is the current incumbent in the US, Donald Trump. And Donald Trump has had over 248 tweets since he became president in the United States. I don't have time to go into it, but I've got the Time magazine with me in the article. Many of those tweets are blatantly untrue. Blatantly untrue. Where did Trump get this? Trump got it because as a businessman, and remember he went bankrupt how many times, Roman? I think 3 or 4 times he went bankrupt. But as a businessman, he used a very interesting phraseology. He spoke of the need in business to spread strategic falsehoods, or to quote him directly, truthful hyperbole. Truthful hyperbole. So Mr. Trump has discovered something about the epistemology of the 21st century, something that Machiavelli already knew. And that is that the truth may be real, and the truth may be important, but falsehood in certain contexts often works better than the truth. Machiavelli already knew that. He wrote about it extensively. So don't break your word unnecessarily, Machiavelli says. But if you have to do it to serve your strategic purposes and interests, you do it, but you maintain the pretense that you are truthful. And those of you who are interested, the latest Time magazine, very wonderful magazine, wonderful, let me just get it for you. deals with this question on the cover, does truth still matter? That's the leading question of Time magazine. Does truth still matter? Is truth dead? Here it is, dear friends. Is truth dead? Very interesting stuff for you still philosophy students to engage in. Very, very interesting stuff. Oh, so now, those are 6 of the themes of Machiavelli. Let me conclude. Let me conclude with 2 ideas, and 2 ideas only. There are many others, but with 2 ideas only. As I already said, The Prince is the slim volume. The Prince made Machiavelli famous rather than the Discourses. And the Discourses is far least read today, perhaps even during his time or shortly after, than the Prince. But there is essentially no argument in the Prince that does not reappear in the Discourses. While the Prince deals with the anatomy of power and with the politics of power, the Discourses deals with the need for republicanism and establishing a republic as the best preferred form rather than city-states of politics. But it's also the story of the Prince, the hero, the war hero, the legislature, the one who ultimately has to create the republic. And most analysts would argue that he dreamt about Rome being the center of that republic for Italy as a whole in the Discourses. Create a republic out of the unlikely or the ambiguous human material that one has to work with in politics. And he ended off by suggesting 6 conditions for Republican rule. 6 conditions, and I want to just mention those. They are quite interesting because they touch on President Geinkop's construct of the Namibian House and the philosophy and the idea of Harambee putting together, building this house, where no Namibian should be left out, to quote him. First, Machiavelli said, you must respect the customs, the traditions, the languages, and wait for it, the history of all your people. You must respect the customs, the traditions, and the history of all your people. 2, you must make sure that the towns can dominate the country and that you can have a clear center of power that makes clear decisions for everybody. 3, that you have a large middle class that can contribute productively to your society and your economy. Our president talks of prosperity and talks about the primacy of, creating and sustaining prosperity in the country. 4, all forms of popular power must be properly institutionalized and instrumentalized. So if you create arenas of power, make sure they are institutionalized and instrumentalized. Make sure they mean something. Make sure they work. Make sure they can make decisions at that level where they have been created. 5, make sure that you have a civil and a civic spirit of virtue. Don't destroy the virtue of what it is to be a Namibian. Don't make Namibia great and Namibians small. Bismarck. Make Germany great and make Germans great. Don't make Namibia great, pretending it's great, and in the process will make Namibians small. And 6, make sure that there is a knowledge of these things. Make sure there is a knowledge of these things. Make sure that there is something called a Namibianness or a Namibian identity that people can aspire to and that they can practice with pride. I have several speeches of the President with me, several official ones, including the speech in Keetmans, the speech to his staff, the speech that he gave when his inaugural speech in 2015, when he took for the first time the podium in Parliament to speak as the third President of the Republic. And if you work through the speeches, you'll see that there is some sensitivity and some awareness about the need to be inclusive. There is some sensitivity, especially the more recent speeches, to keep the flatterers and the others at bay, not to give them too much access to State House. Keetmans wrote, he said the party is not against business, but it has to be done according to the precepts of the law, and so on and so forth. So you begin to see that some of these sensitivities are coming through. Keetmans wrote, I quote, he said, SWAPO is not against the pursuit of business success. Some people now claim that SWAPO is trying to prevent them from pursuing their business interests. We are not against businesses and the generation of financial wealth. We are only governed to ensuring that the pursuit of business and wealth takes place legally with adherence to the rule of law. And so you can start seeing some very interesting resonances coming through, and I think we're going to see more of those as we enter this rather unusual, some say mad year of the Congress in the contestation for leadership. Let me stop there because we still have, how much? Half an hour. Okay, thank you so much, dear friends. Thank you for coming. Thank you for showing an interest in this discussion. I think it just proves the point that, one can look at things through different lenses. And it does matter if one reads a bit of history and a bit of philosophy. Yeah, it's open now, so please, questions, differences, critiques, whatever you want to.
Thank you.
The question that I do have is basically related to the theme of better to be feared than loved. I just want to relate that to the Namibian context, or even South Africa, where President Zuma is firing his staff, or some of his cabinet, or even some of our prominent ministers or president here in Namibia, or the president of Namibia, for example, threatening some of their ministers and subordinates. We're hearing rumors that some of his advisors even resigned and he came back. Could it be that the approach that our current president has is a Machiavelli? If it is, what can be done to calm him down, because this is too much? Thank you.
The question of hunting, where in post-colonial Africa, former liberation movements have significantly done the hunting to consolidate power through sometimes subversive means and other times fraudulent electoral outcomes, and that they have as a result consolidated themselves and create the norm that they are always going to be two-thirds majority holders. What would be the space for hunting in that context when you have literally hunted every political space? And in the hunting process, how much room do you leave for the Republican ideals of democracy, of free speech, of expression to flourish? Or do you hunt and take all the kudus and the hemsbok and leave no space for any others? The third and the last is, how do you reverse the gains of greed by beginning to limit yourself, your institution, your ruling parties that have themselves become the agents of corruption through own enterprise? How do you begin to tell your soldiers not to be greedy any longer? And at what price do you do?
The concern I have with Machiavelli's approach to the polis, to managing the affairs of a nation, is that he seems inclined to preserve the status quo, to preserve the natural order of things. Only thing is, if you preserve the status quo, if you preserve the natural order of things, society doesn't grow, it stagnates. And at worst, it may go into slow and then an accelerated regression, where we are faced with limitations with humans. But unlike the animals of the natural order of justice that submit to limitations and adapt to limitations, we actively rebel against limitations. That is what makes us human. That is what makes us gods. That we will not accept limitations, but that we will overthrow limitations and determine our own reality. But how can that be achieved in a state where you merely want to achieve a position of comfort in a natural order of things and not want more than that? And yet Machiavelli acknowledges that man hungers for power after power. How long can one really be happy with everything in a limited society?
It's interesting when one reads the popular press on the current president. One of the themes, or one of the scenes in the coverage is that there is some uncertainty and there is almost something close to a witch hunt going on around him and those that are close to him, and that it's driven by fear and by uncertainty of what might happen. I personally don't read it like that. I personally think fear plays a part in our politics, and perhaps plays a part in any politics. Fear is always there. It's always one of those tangibles or intangibles, depending on how you look at it. And there is an issue about authority. What makes the state and what makes politics legitimate? The questions of legitimacy. How do you establish legitimacy? Some people try to establish legitimacy by striking fear in the hearts of those close to them, but also in their potential opponents. So that you run that and you develop quite an interesting model and an interesting logic around fear. Fear is there, but if you read the president carefully, and I want to also plead what should happen is that one should take the different narratives, including the narrative of the Namibian House and Harambee and all the other narratives, and the narrative of prosperity, and the narrative of inclusivity. One should take those narratives together and dissect them. I have with me the speech he gave this year, recently, when he addressed his staff, and where he was asking them, why do you look so unhappy? Are you excited? Are you ready to work? Are you committed? Sort of casting almost doubt on the level of commitment and, in a sense, the level of loyalty the staff has towards him. It's not only fear, also the politics of loyalty. Can you be trusted? Are you loyal? You know? So it's a very complex arena in politics that we need to look at very, very carefully. But I think the problem is we tend to see the speeches separately instead of trying to find the themes and the seams that cut across the different speeches. Then you begin to see the pattern. And if you look, for example, at his inaugural speech, when he took the presidency, he spoke about land. And he said almost exactly what he said now at Rundu. Almost exactly to the word about that we'll revisit the willing buyer, willing seller, and so on. And now I'm casting it broader, but you know, that's what I suggest one needs to do. One should do more textual analysis, try to bring together some of the major articulations and speeches of him, and then try to make sense of them, to unpack them. Is he a bully? Well, I don't know. I haven't been bullied yet. But some say he might be. I'm not saying he is, but some say he might be. But he likes a challenge, but he doesn't like to be challenged on certain things. That is absolutely clear. He doesn't like to be challenged on certain things. Then you become a professor of doom, or you become, you know, a person who is a distractor. Should he listen to all these voices? This was the theme of this wonderful letter. In New Era it was last week. Should he be distracted by all the noise, you know, in politics? The answer is clearly no. He shouldn't be distracted by all the noise. Nor should he react to all the noise. This is more important. Nor should he react to all the noise. This is just good political advice. Don't react to everything that people say, and all the, you know, the disturbances and the decibels that people raise. Don't react to all of them. Stay above it, you know. Be focused, have your agenda, move the country forward, provide a center to our politics. This is what Machiavelli wrote about beautifully around that issue. And I think, you know, he likes to score points. He's a point scorer. He likes to score points publicly. And that I personally don't like that. I must tell you that. I don't go with it. I'm very outspoken on it. I mean, engage people, engage their arguments, but don't respond, react to everything. Don't belittle people. That's wrong. Okay, that's the answer. Now, questions, Bernardus' very important observations. This whole construct of hunting, both as a practice and as a metaphor, is of course extraordinarily important in politics. Because in a sense, politicians are hunters. They go out to capture people, they go out to capture territory, they go out to capture constituencies, they go out to capture interests, rather than be captured by those interests or those constituencies. So, you know, this old fable of the hunter, as you all know, is central also to colonialism. As you all know, the great white hunter that comes to the dark continent, you know, with a nice gun. And it's fantastically interesting. If you read Fanon, and you read The Wretched of the Earth, but especially Black Skin, White Masks, you cannot meet the social, human, developmental needs of people and the country by invoking the liberation narrative. That is part of your narrative, but that is not the answer. You need to develop a new language, a new grammar of politics. You need to resonate differently with people and take the totality of the history into consideration. We see this difference very clearly around the issue of the negotiations with the Germans. We see it very, very clearly around issues of land. By somehow, some people's histories seem to matter more than others. And that, I think, is where we are now. Thank you, Roman. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you. So I think that's something that we need to work on collectively as Namibians, reimagining Namibia in different ways, with due recognition to the histories, the diversity, because that's the strength of the country. You know, that can build a house, but can build a house where these bricks can all fit in. I think that is the problem. The more complex problem is the tendency of power to corrupt. And I think one can argue, and you don't need to invoke Lord Acton, you know, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. You don't have to invoke that. You can if you want. But there is a tendency that most forms of power tend to be corrosive. If power is not challenged, and if you don't have space to challenge that power. Because the danger, and this is the brilliant thing of Fanon. Fanon spoke about the closed epistemologies of power. The closed epistemologies of power, meaning that you don't allow space for other forms of knowledge, other histories, other readings of your reality, but you all try to collapse everything into your reading of the history of the future of the past. And Fanon is and I will give a public lecture on Fanon, I hope very soon, and I hope it will be hundreds of people will come, even thousands, not because of me, but because of the message of Fanon. And that is the danger, I think, is that you have now approached the point in this country, and certainly in Zimbabwe, it's a very good illustration, where the epistemology, the grammar, the language has become closed. And then, if you're there, where do you go from there? You then have to wait for the people to die, literally, for nature to take its course. Where do you go from there? Where do you envision? How do you envision? How do you develop what Fanon called the radical humanism? Because the problem with that, and I'm not saying Namibia is there yet, but the problem with that is that ultimately what suffers is the very idea of humanism itself. It's under threat. Because you don't allow, that contestation of ideas, and you don't allow a more radical, a more new, different reading of a society. And that is the problem. Okay, Machiavelli says, only thing you need to do is you need to keep all your flatterers, those who flatter you regularly, at bay because they have agendas. They are saying good things about you because they have personal agendas. And they deal in what is said half-truths. So keep them away from you. It's not easy in politics, it's extraordinarily hard. But there are indications that the current president is understanding that now. He's beginning to, let me rephrase, he's beginning to understand that you need to keep some people away from you, because they might just do the wrong thing. A very interesting example that I think really is politically fascinating, apart from the technicalities of law, you being a lawyer, is this Chinese contract on the airport, where the president, to his credit, he wasn't alone, of course, we know that, but to his credit said, this is inflated. This has escalated beyond reasonable boundaries. Now let us say no now. And of course the courts have now vindicated him, on technicalities and so on, as you know. But that's the kind of leadership that I'm looking for. And I would say that's the leadership that Machiavelli would have wanted. Now Johan's question is, of course, a very hard, central question in philosophy. How do we get humans to accept limits and to accept that they cannot and should not play God? And how do we instill in them the ethics, that certain things are doable and others are not, including the ethics around our planet and the survival of the planet and the integrity of the human species and the planet. Very deep moral question. Animals, in a way, have mechanisms, as you suggested, biologically and so on, to control that, not to do the excessive things. But humans have the tendency to want to do things that are grossly excessive and grossly damaging to themselves. It's a very, very important question in moral philosophy. Many philosophers have written on it and have given different answers. Many have given very different sets of answers, which we can discuss, and it'd be nice to talk to you about some of them. But I think you're absolutely right. That sometimes we cannot maximize in politics. You cannot maximize because there simply isn't enough to maximize. You have to develop what Bergson and other philosophers call the golden mean. Even Aristotle, as you know, in his Ethics, he worked with that idea. So somewhere you need to find that balance between your resources, finite and infinite, and your capacities and your needs. You need to balance needs and rights. That's another challenge morally, and so on, So you're right, those are the kinds of big problems. And of course, Machiavelli didn't really deal with them. As you rightly said, he didn't really unpack them, morally and in a deep philosophical sense. So what would be the golden mean for Namibia? Where can we go with the resources that we have? What capacities are there still that we have not managed properly and utilized properly? We are going to meet our international relations minister on Friday to talk about water management and ecological questions between us, Botswana and Angola, Friday morning. Exactly those questions, If we continue extracting, eventually, we'll all suffer and our social systems will collapse and our environment clearly will collapse. So those are the hard questions.